We'll take 5 more minutes so that there are good audience in this room. The numbers are building slowly and slowly. People are having tea outside. Now the bell is ringing also, so they know they have to attend sessions. So let's wait for 5 minutes. I'll introduce the session and then I'll introduce the panelist also. Let's wait. 30 people in the room. So before even I introduce a session, I would like to again mention that there are 3 parallel sessions running right now. Okay, one session is on cybersecurity industry building, which is the primary agenda of DSCI these days. And Rama also mentioned in the inaugural address that we have a target of taking the industry to $35 billion USD by 2025. So Rama would be moderating that. And then in this room, we have a session on cognitive risk framework. I'll come back to it again. And another room, I think, after demonetization, we were introduced to the cashless economy world formally in India. We were already part of it. Some of us were already cashless when we looked at our purses. So at that demonetized day, if I remember, I had 20 rupees in my pocket. So I was already demonetized. So nothing new for me, but that was newly introduced to some part of or some sections of the society in India. Now coming back to this particular session which we have today on cognitive risk framework. So when we were conceptualizing the agenda, and I was talking to the panelists also, that we used to live in the world of IT risk landscape, and then it leading to enterprise risk landscape. So what is this enigma called cognitive risk, right? So then I started thinking about that. If cognitive computing can be in the hands of developers, it can be in the hands of the defenders, then there is a good chance that cognitive computing capabilities are also available for the hackers also. So how do you make your organization one step, so how you are prepared or one step ahead of hackers so that you are able to handle the risk because of cognitive hacking? Okay, so I see it more from an operation perspective. Do you need a new risk framework for it? Do you need or do you need some changes in the existing IT risk framework or enterprise risk framework? So I requested the panelists also that before we get into the nuances of what is this framework all about, what are the drivers of it, what is cyber paradox, the term associated with it. So let us first define what is cognitive risk. Then come to the framework part, and then we can discuss the nitty-gritties or the use cases or some business translations of it also. So with further ado, not taking so much of time, I'd like to introduce a panelist, starting from the moderator, Mr. Renju Varghese. He is Director Global Practices HCL. Then we have Mr. Vibhav Agarwal. He is Director Product Marketing Metric Stream. Next is Mr. Shivakumar Shiriraman. He is CRO India and South Asia Visa. And Mr. Forum Mehta, he is Head of InfoSec APAC PayPal. So now I would request all the panelists if they can join us on the stage, and over to the moderator.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So my name is Renju. We're just putting name to faces. I'll just pass the mic around.
Yeah, my name is Vibhav. I'm the Director of Product Marketing at Metric Stream.
My name is Shivakumar Sriraman. I'm the Chief Risk Officer for India and South Asian Visa.
I'm Forum. Hi, everybody. I lead the InfoSec function for PayPal for the Asia Pacific region.
So I think this is a very interesting topic, and for all the events that we are seeing as we are addressing the cybersecurity or the risk market and the risk challenges, what we are also seeing is that there is a lot of inbuilt intelligence or cognitive capabilities which are being brought in, not only in the protection space, but also in the spaces of how it is used to breach and extract records as well as create disruptions. And that mandates that we should have a very strong risk framework to address it. Now, how do you use cognitive or how is cognitive being used in that space? There are bots which are today written to transfer malware into the systems. There are phishing and other events and other attacks to address how the users are being used to transfer and be the source of infections. And that is where it mandates now, how we can go ahead and build a very strong and better framework from a risk management and response mechanism, that can cover for today's as well as tomorrow's world. Okay. And with that, I think the biggest topic that Mike also touched upon is about the cyber paradox space. And cyber paradox is, or paradox as it states, is a event such as a situation which can be made up of two opposite things which cannot come together, but eventually comes together to be true. That's the paradox. And what happens in cyber is that one of the paradox is the amount of money that is being spent in protecting the environment, but it does not provide enough of protection, and we hear more and more breaches. Now it's kind of competing and conflicting with each other, and that's kind of a paradox. And similarly, I will ask Forum to give some other context on similar paradoxes that he would have seen during his experience.
Thanks, Ranger. So, I think, paradoxes have been around for a while. If you think of a mathematical paradox, you have the whole famous, there is one barber in a village who is asked to, every male has to get themselves shaved from that barber, but the person cannot shave themselves, right? So it's a simple rule, and then the question is, who shaves the barber? So you can't solve that problem. The same thing, and I was attending a session next door, is software-defined security. If you look at vulnerabilities that have come out in the last few years that have really been global, from Heartbleed to Poodle, they've all talked about how software itself is implemented, right? And if the security software or the software that is supposed to provide you the security itself has a security exploit, then how do you fix that problem? There's lots of paradoxes around cybersecurity, and the biggest problem is we're still kind of getting to a point where cybersecurity becomes mainstream. We're struggling to show the ROI, the value that comes by investing in cybersecurity, how it is an enabling function, while the technology advancements are making it more and more difficult or easier, depending on how you look at it, to come up with new attacks and risk frameworks from a defense and attack perspective. So I think throughout the session, we'll go through how we as practitioners are looking at this framework and adopting different parts of it in developing ways of combating what's coming next because of the advancements around all the various terms that people have been talking about around learning using machines or introducing intelligence using data and the computing power.
Thanks, Varun. When it comes to paradox, especially in the area of payments from where I'm coming from, we've seen the technological advancements which happened on the payment space. People think that by introducing a chip card, the security is taken care. By introducing a second factor authentication for a payment, the security is taken care. Actually, it's not. Even after introduction of some of these advancements like chip card or introduction of a second factor authentication, the breaches still continue to happen, and still there are frauds which happen on the card not present area as well. So how do we address this from a cognitive security framework is something which probably we'll discuss it down the line. But when you specifically talk about paradox, it's like people think that saying by introducing a chip card, my fraud is taken care, so there will not be any fraud, or by introducing a second factor authentication, the fraud is taken care. Actually, it's not. There are a lot of things which needs to be done, and especially in the area of fraud prevention and detection, there is a huge scope, and cognitive framework will help to build and bridge that gap.
Before I come to experiences that I have seen as a part of metric stream, one general experience which you may also remember happened some time ago, which sort of exemplified this whole security paradox in a very, I would say, compassionate manner, was what Apple faced. when the whole San Bernardino attack happened in US, and Apple was asked to break it into its own phone and provide FBI with a backdoor entry into the whole encryption and the privacy that it had created. And then Tim Cook went and said that no, they will not allow FBI a formal backdoor entry, because that would expose a whole gamut of privacy issues that will come into fore. And it was a very hotly debated topic. I don't think there's a single answer to the whole point, but it was one of the most glaring examples of the whole security paradox, that while you would want to create almost like a system that cannot be breached, but in certain cases you would ideally want to have some kind of backdoor entry into it. But then when you do that, you are exposing yourself to not only the good Samaritans, but also to the, I would say, the hackers who would be exploiting the data. From a GRC perspective, the world that I come from, governance, risk and compliance, this is an issue that we grapple every day, because essentially the software that we sell is something that is akin to insurance. On a good day, there is absolutely no value that is attached to it. It's only when something bad happens, then people start attaching a value to it. And I mean, the real value is not of a cyber insurance or of a cyber defense system, is not the value of the breach, the data that's stolen. So how exactly do you put a value to it? How exactly do you define an ROI to it? So that's also examples of cyber paradox that I have seen in my experience.
Yeah, those are very interesting insights. One other interesting aspect to this is, while researchers have been researching on the number of breaches, they've also been researching on, how does the cyber underworld actually work? And when they did that research, they came out with some interesting viewpoints. One of the interesting viewpoints is there is a very small percentile of hackers who can actually go ahead and hack hardened systems, while there is a larger percentile of hackers who are part and parcel of the fact that they can use certain platforms and perform those tasks. Now, what it also brings in is that the total investment that is happening in cybersecurity to protect the enterprise and the important data, is it happening in the right place? What is the weakest link? And that's where the whole game starts. The weakest link, incidentally, is the human brain. You can have the best of technologies and the best of products to protect everything, right from who's accessing what and what's the kind of access and what's the kind of privileges. But it's still coming back to the human brain of how it can be twisted to perform certain tasks which are not controlled by technology. It could be in the form of phishing attacks, or it could be in the form of certain bots which are transmitting malware. And that is where the whole aspect of this cognitive risk framework for cybersecurity becomes a complete necessity. And going from there, what does it take to bring, or to first be the first building block for a cybersecurity or a cyber risk framework for security? And I would hand it off to Shiva to look at his.
Thanks, Ranju. Just to, before I start about how do we create that framework, just to give you a perspective of how payments ecosystem is evolving in the country, specific to India. It's seeing a paradigm shift. The entire banking industry is seeing a paradigm shift. Most of the times it comes to a stage saying it's a very complicated equation, right? Security plus innovation. Because one side, the innovation is going at a speed, but security is not catching up. So is there a way to relook at the things which are happening today? Because there are too many things happening, especially post demonetization. The amount of push towards digitization has made the banks to move in a faster lane on the innovation side, but security is probably taken a backseat. So how do we address this? Basically at a crossroads, right? How do we balance this equation? In the name of convenience, probably the products or the services which the banks provide has moved ahead. But it's like a equation, right? What will balance this equation of convenience and security? How do we do it? Because today data plays that balancing role in between the convenience and security, anything, whatever the banking institution does today, data flow which is available on a transaction is very, very high. So how do we make use of this data? Going back to, again, what's happening is there are sophisticated devices which are emerging. Today, mobile has become ubiquitous, right? It's just an extension of hand. There is no people around here today doesn't have a mobile when it comes to a banking transactions. And most of the banking transactions happen today on a mobile. So these devices deliver a lot of information today to the banking industry. Similarly, the same devices also deliver a lot of information to the crooks. The fraudsters also take this data and make use of the data for them to exploit. How can the banking industry can also use the data to safeguard themselves? That's where cognitive risk framework will help them. I'll just give you an example. Today, India is, as you know, it's a completely 100% second factor authentication market, right? Every transaction today, you need to provide an additional password. So what we have done through this, we have pushed the fraudsters community to either take the credentials through technology-oriented frauds or reach out to customers who are gullible who can voice out the credentials. These are the two ways which are happening. So banking industry is struggling. How do we address both? One is to have solutions to identify where the transaction is originating from. That's where probably the risk framework where we talk about cognitive capabilities of identifying the originating device. Days have gone. The legacy of monitoring threshold-based or value-based or country-based, velocity-based monitoring has become legacy today. People need to change that mindset of moving towards the originating device. Where is the transaction originating from? Is it from the same device which the customer had transacted last week, the week before, or the month before? People have to start building that behavior profile or the device profile of a consumer. Once they see a deviation or aberration from the customer's, the way of transaction, then they need to look at having an additional form of authentication. That's what we call as a risk-based authentication. Rather than moving into 100% authentication and keep ourselves in the backseat and say, by asking for additional password, I'm secure. No, it's not. Because fraudsters have exploited it. They either put in a malware in the mobile to take the OTP or do a call out to gullible customers and wish out the OTP. So this is an area where probably people need to think through and come out with a clear framework. How do we start monitoring the device credentials of the consumer? Especially with, coming from Visa, I know almost every second transaction in the country is a card not present. A physical card is not present. The form factors are changing. It can be a mobile, it can be your wearables, it can be your QR codes. There are a lot of innovation which is happening. So almost every second transaction is a card, physical card not present transaction. And if you take that as a universe, almost 68 to 70% of the transaction is from a handheld device. It's not a desktop or a laptop. It's a mobile or a tablet. So to that extent, things are moving fast. So you have all that information available with you. So how do we make use of it? How do we create that framework is something which we need to move towards, and people have started the journey. I have seen some of the banks implementing some of this and also identifying, they're binding the device to a consumer, which is a very healthy trend. People have started doing that, and the lot of things which are coming on the Pay side, right? Your Apple Pay, your Samsung Pay, your Android Pay, all these are coming. They are started doing this. They are able to bind the device to the consumer where they'll be able to do a risk-based authentication. So this framework is extremely important, and I'm confident saying banks are moving in that direction.
Just quickly add a little bit to it. I mean, if I have to break it all down to what does cognitive risk framework starts to look like, I would go back to what Mr. Pillai said this morning. I don't think we need to get into the hype and remember what the fundamentals look like. And the risk framework itself is a pretty mature science when it comes to any of the other industries, even IT. So only thing that has changed over the last decade or so is two things, right? One is big data, the second is big compute. So a lot of people, so from example of PayPal itself, so we are operating in 200 plus markets with 200 million customers. Now, everybody knows that data is kind of king, right? And Shiva mentioned just that. So now people have a lot of data. The computing power based on Moore's law and all the other advancements, obviously now we have a lot of compute. What we don't have is people who are able to use and make sense of this intelligence to create some kind of a learning or cognition to take a risk-based decision as fast as we need. And that's why the cognitive risk framework just combines these two as just a gradual advancement in those areas, doing two key things. One, very simple, is automation. Identifying patterns much faster, utilizing all of this data as quickly as possible with the volume and the velocity that it needs. And the second is personalization. So as we create experiences for individuals, same thing, right? Today, it doesn't matter who you are. If you call for a customer service, you have to go through the same channel. It doesn't matter what, and you have to provide the same request, same information before you get any kind of service. Same thing from an authentication perspective. It doesn't matter what is it that you are trying to do. First thing is you have to authenticate. And the bad part is, if you have authenticated, it doesn't matter whether yesterday you did a $25 transaction and today you're doing.
Where this cognitive risk framework is actually already making some inroads. The first is from the area of cybersecurity only, where I think in the other sessions I heard that the number of threat intelligence feeds that are actually hitting the users today, and these are users who actually want to use them, is probably running into thousands a day. And there is no real way a sane human can actually consume all of this and process it in a very, very unbiased manner to actually apply this to its business, to its IT systems as it is needed. So a cognitive risk framework, obviously using all the strategies and the characteristics that Shiva and Forum have said, will automatically identify patterns, will probably even use some of the social media characteristics to identify which are the better ones, which are not the better ones to look at, and will prioritize them for the user. So the user will get a very, very, I would say, curated piece of intelligence, which is in its business context, in its IT context, and is prioritized based on its relevance, which he can then action upon. Now, in certain advanced economies, it has even gone one step further, where even the action that needs to be taken in this scenario is inbuilt. So it not only states that these are the two problems that you may face in your IT systems, it also suggests that other users took these kind of actions. So it is prescriptive in nature. It's not only predicting and telling you what are the right feeds for you to look at, it's actually prescribing the action that you need to take care of it. And that's where it sort of removes the human bias, the human feeling out of it, and makes your response that much better. The same situation is actually happening in certain highly regulated industries like pharma. From a regulation technology perspective, you're getting bombarded with so many advisories, so many regulations, and so many events are happening across the world that you do not know how to correlate those events to what, let's say, you are bringing to the market. So again, a risk framework like this will automatically filter out the noise and sort of bring out the voice in terms of what is important for your business, and already make it available to you to action upon. And this is something, given the vastness of the data, given the different structures of the data, it's almost incomprehensible for a human. Even if you put 30, 40 people to do it, I don't think you will be able to get those kind of results.
Thanks. Let me go ahead and put all of this in one single perspective so that it becomes easier. And I think what we require is a very clear understanding and agreement on the roles of each data and its management. We will require a very clear risk and decision support analytics system, which is having parameters for dealing with both structured data, which is what we are all used to, and unstructured data, which is coming from multiple sources like the social media, like what Vibhav mentioned, or data which is coming from different transactions of technology, and how do we integrate technology to help us create that cognitive map. So that's kind of putting all of that in perspective on what would be the basis for us to go ahead and create the risk framework for cybersecurity from a cognitive standpoint, which is interesting because it is addressing not only the aspect of the two-dimensional or one-dimensional model of addressing security, it is also bringing in the multi-dimensional model, which could also come in from people as they are transacting and the devices they are using and the data they're generating or accessing, which is all part of that landscape. I think from there, we will have to then look at how do we go ahead and define what are the 5 pillars. I'll just give a few examples, or some pillars to build what the framework will have. Now, some examples would be, what would be our intentional control design? So intentional control design would be controls that would be defined by the enterprise as well as the regulators. Okay. What would be the design for cognitive informatics security? Okay, because how do we look through all of those set of data, type of access, parameters of behavioral patterns, parameters of risk that they bring in, and how do we put security to it? How do we create a very intelligent cognitive risk governance on top of it so that it gives a good amount of decision points for us to respond? And how do we put cybersecurity intelligence and active defense rather than being a reactive model? And looking at what would be the legal considerations in the cyberspace, where this whole thing would address. Okay, and one aspect is about how do we look at risk, whether it is risk when we are trying to respond to it from a breach standpoint, which would be reactive, to a risk which is more quantitative and can be predictive. So so that we can have plans and mechanisms to start addressing it. So I will request Vibhav to give some perspective.
So when we look at a cognitive risk framework, and Renju put it in, I think, 5 very structured points. Let's start with the first point, which is what we call the intentional controls. Now, obviously, when you're looking at a risk framework, you are basically looking to control those risks. You are obviously looking at how to bring those risks down, right? And obviously, for that, you need certain amount of controls to be put in place. So when you're looking at a cognitive risk framework, you are looking to have these controls sort of automatically kick in at some point of time and start taking certain actions, right? A simple thing, for example, can be that the control should determine, what is the threshold that you are willing to accept a certain risk at, or a certain quantity, and at what threshold will you inform X person, and at what higher threshold will you inform Y person. So these kind of rules basically need to be created within the organization. And while it looks very easy, but believe me, in an organization, creating this kind of a common taxonomy of rules, common taxonomy of controls is not a very easy thing. So orchestrating kind of a common language, if I may use that word, for risks and controls is going to be really, really difficult in organizations. And that's where, that's probably the first step in terms of defining, your cognitive risk framework, right? Once you've defined this framework, what was the second point?
Cognitive informatics security?
Yeah. So basically then, obviously, on top of, once you've defined these controls, then you need the information security and the risk governance piece, where you are looking at what are your most critical business assets, what are your most critical business processes, right, which contain the most amount of information, and creating a risk framework around those. And again, here you're looking at completely automating it in such a way that the system can handle it, even the actions, even the notifications that need to come can be basically sent by the system. And again, going back to my previous point, all this requires a very high level of streamlining of processes, of assets, of the language within the organization in terms of what is important, what is not important, what kind of context does it become important in order to make this kind of a cognitive risk framework actually mature and work for you?
See, the cognitive framework per se was existing probably on the business side of it. What is cognitive? Like, it's like self-learning or building models and try to help out. Most of the time it used to happen for either on the acquisition side or on the attrition side. Most of the institutions use that, right? But today we are talking about how do we use that framework on the security side or the risk management side of it. Is it, as a concept, cognitive framework used to exist there, but predominantly it was used on the business side of it. Can we use the same on the risk framework and security side? The answer is yes. But the journey has to start now, and probably we might not reach an ideal cognitive risk framework on the security side on day one. But it's a journey which probably we need to start now, and we will end up probably 2-3 years down the line, we will have a more structured form of dealing with that. That's something which I wanted to say.
I mean, I think a lot of work, as my esteemed panelists mentioned, a lot of work will happen in all of these 5 pillars over the years, and there's debate, discussions, and multiple ways that people will come up in offering solutions around it. One of the pillars in which we have invested a lot of time and energy and have implemented something is in active defense. So over the last 20 years, we've learned from a customer's perspective, their life cycle perspective, from a purely risk management perspective, we do 4 things, right? One is authentication when they enter the system. The second is compliance, just understanding and creating a value or a confidence in the financial instrument that they are interacting with. The third is the actual fraud or the transaction risk. And the fourth is the exit. Because we deal with money, we have to understand where the money comes in and comes out. And being a 2-sided network, which means every PayPal transaction, both the buyer as well as the seller is actually a customer of ours. We have that vantage point to see a transaction throughout its life. And when you combine that with how cybersecurity has evolved, as there's lot of talk been done, and the vendors outside have been saying insiders in one shape, form or another are responsible for 70% or more of successful breaches. So we thought we'd develop so much IP in understanding risk, how it percolates through from our external or from our customer's perspective. Why don't we turn it around and look at every single insiders? So what we've come up with is an active defense, or we call it proactive security strategy, to understand 2 aspects of our business. One is identity. Everything from creation of what that account does, what it has access to, privileged accounts, dormant accounts, all of that. And identity could be a user, could be a system, could be anything, but that's an identity that we want to understand everything about. And the second aspect is the system. Whether it's an application, a operating system, a actual network device, whatever it is, but the system has a good state that you can very easily define based on baseline standards and configuration aspects. And when it gets modified, you would understand what has modified. So to bring all of this together, we acquired a company in Israel that does malware analytics, right? So they did research to find out that about 50% or more of the code for every single malware that exists today is exactly the same. So now when you apply that pattern and cognition, or whatever you want to call it, machine learning is what we call it, you can create permutations and combination of every single way this identity could be used or modified or abused, every single way the system could behave. And together you can create profiles of what a good behavior looks like, what a bad behavior looks like, and what an anomalous behavior looks like, which allows you to investigate this further. And this is what we use actively to understand whenever an exec or anybody becomes a victim of spear phishing, what to do, what to stop, at what aspect to do 2 things. Obviously to contain the damage, but to minimize the disruption to anybody else. And like I said, all the other areas will evolve over time, but this is clearly one area where there's enough advancement that has happened to directly now apply cognition or learning, or we call it just automation and machine learning, to get ahead of what is happening in terms of cybercrime.
Thanks. So I think so from all the discussions, I think the main part of the story is, that this is going to be an evolutionary step to look at how we identify risk, and how we measure it, and how we address it from a quantitative standpoint. So that there is an absolute straightforward mechanism which is predictive to go ahead and address each of those risks. And we move away from an intuitive or a hunch-based model to a more predictive and more realistic models. Okay. I think, so having gone through that, we'll have to look at what would be the goal for this framework. I think the main goal of the framework is to transform the complete vision of looking at risk and looking at mechanisms of how we address those risks and how we bring in every aspect of that organization, be it the technology aspect and the user aspect. Identify what is the weakest link, which today is the human brain. How do we go ahead and provide protection in that space and comprehensively put the right set of dollars in the right place, and we are able to protect the breaches. And it might be different, and from an industry perspective, you would have a complete different view and how it would be applicable and what you would be seeing in your specific industry. So Forum, if you could give a slight insight into it.
Yeah, probably just, kind of like what I just mentioned is understanding two things is where, you could apply cognitive science to get better, right? It's not going to be applicable at every single aspect, and you're not going to be better just because you have big data and big compute to apply it and see what you could do and how you use the intelligence. But the key thing is also, when you quantify it around measurement that could be exposed to the business where you are able to show return on your investments or the type of attacks that are happening, or understanding everything from a data-backed trend perspective that allows you to make better decisions. There is obviously, as Mayank started with, was what would happen when the bad guys also use the same technologies that we are using to try and attack the systems or try and fool the systems. And this is where having a data-based strategy or a risk-based framework that is able to adapt, be dynamic, and understand how every aspect of your profile changes will be instrumental in helping us stay ahead.
As I said earlier, it's a journey which needs to start now for us to move ahead, because people need to understand saying it's not just a risk management of managing an incident, it is how we change our mindset towards proactive risk management versus a reactive risk management. And I believe cognitive risk framework will help you to achieve that, saying how do we address proactively rather than reacting to a breach.
Yeah. One more aspect that I think a lot of people think about, and rightly so, is the cost of putting in place a system. I mean, big data and big compute is definitely available. The costs are going down, but it's also the processing, activities that are needed to actually bring some result out of this, and that's what the business is going to be asking when you actually go and ask them for some amount of funding, into these kind of activities. So as Forum rightly said, you need to look at the lowest hanging fruit that you can sort of put in place in terms of the shortest, I would say, result that you can get. And in each context, in each business, it's going to be something different. So for example, I've seen something in pharma, which I just told in the start of the session about, being able to interpret the different regulations and feeds that are coming in. But in other financial contexts, it can be something different, as Shiva said. So from a business perspective, that's going to be the key. When you go and build your business case, you should be able to start small, show some results which are actually of use to the business person or to the user, is able to translate into clear business benefits, and then sort of take it on as a journey on tackling it on a larger and larger scale. So, I mean, cognitive risk framework, if I look at it, it's something that's just kicking off. Will take about 5 to 7 years to come into some kind of a shape where it can be adopted on a large scale. But it's something that we can already realize is definitely going to be very important to, as what Renju said, remove the human feeling element, which is very, very prevalent in risk management today, and basically bring in a risk analysis kind of a framework, which is a very, very quantitative, very, very rule-based, and very, very business-oriented analysis in every situation.
Yeah, so I think this particular panel, we wanted to introduce what would be the next future state as cognitive comes in and cognitive technologies are adopted both by the people who are required to protect and also the people who are more intended to break into the system. And I think with the eminent panelists here, we've been able to bring that thought process to you, and you will start to see a lot of discussions on these frameworks, on cybersecurity, risk framework using cognitive, coming up in multiple discussion points over the course of next years, because it's going to catch up. It's going to be the only response mechanism that we will start to see. With that, I would thank everybody's patience and attention, and at the same time, all the eminent panelists here to make their time for this discussion. Thank you.